Night breathes against old stone, and the cloister holds its breath. Wax gutters on the lip of a vigil lamp. The icon's gold seems to tremble. Beyond the convent wall, hooves splash through winter ruts. Voices scrape across the dark in a language of orders and measurements. And the world of empires presses its thumb to the thin skin of prayer. Here, women live by a clock older than any sultan's rain matins, before dawn. Psalms like stitched light, bread kneaded with silence, but doors have hinges for a reason. History does not knock, it enters. Under Ottoman rule, the law said Christians could pray, could own, could dress their grief in black, and carry it to church. The law said monasteries and convents belonged to a tolerated fold, pinned into place by firmans, stamped with the looping mercy of a calligraphed seal. This was coexistence measured in receipts, jizya tallied, averas assessed, petitions ribboned with fees that smelled of incense and fear. Every privilege was written on paper that burned like any other. The millet system promised a space to live just wide enough to bow in if you did not lift your head too high. And in that narrow corridor, the nuns learned to walk single file, steady and unblinking. Morning brought the sound of sandals in the courtyard, and the drift of a cedar pen across parchment. A monk from a neighboring monastery came with a ledger. Dates of harvest, notes on repairs, the cost of oil. A Cadiz scribe followed, official eyes traveling over the threshold, counting faces, counting candles, counting possibilities. The abbess offered coffee, her hospitality precise. Not lavish, could be mistaken for a challenge, meager for an insult. Between the syllables of politeness, the truth spoke without words. Safety is rented here, never purchased. Protection is a bridge you must rebuild every time you cross it. Autumn tasted of copper and smoke. Soldiers on the move meant quartering beds lifted from cells to the refectory, pots filling not with Lenten stews, but with the appetite of strangers. Some officers crossed themselves in awkward respect before the icon screen. Others did not look at the women at all, as if erasing them would make the convent easier to own. A few were kind in the quiet way that survives beneath uniforms. A warning whispered about a planned inspection, a purse pressed into the abbess's palm. For the orphans, he said, as if the words could absolve him of the boots that frightened them. Then there were nights when kindness took the long way home, door splintered, and the wind learned new syllables. Vows met brute force, and there was no poetry to steady the moment-only bodies. Fragile for all their courage and eyes that refused to close, some nuns vanished into the machinery of war and profit. Captives parceled out, as if people were harvest. Ransomers labored at the edges of this economy of grief, hawking futures for coin, traveling across provinces with letters sewn into hymns, haggling with men who treated mercy as just another mercantile exchange. Others were frightened into renunciation, new names spoken over old souls, or they were counted dead and later found alive. Living under the shadow of choices nobody should have to make. On other days, the convent was a harbor steadier than any fleet. Governors with a taste for prestige sent endowments, pious or political or both. Muslim neighbors brought figs at feast time and asked after the abbess's health. A firman arrived, its ink still moist, instructing officials to keep sharp hands away from church doors. The paper hung beside the icon of the Theotokos like a second halo, no guarantee, just a pause in a storm. A pause can be enough to weather a season. Across centuries, the scenes repeated, changing only costumes. In the Balkans, a village bell could still its tongue for years, its mouth stuffed with rags at the order of a distant decree, while women kept time with their pulse, their hymns advancing without bronze to shepherd them. In Anatolia, a convent crushed olives in a courtyard surrounded by apricot trees, the sisters' hands stained with oil and ink as they copied service books in fading script. In the islands, sails flickered like white quotation marks around a sentence of law nobody could quite memorize. Everywhere the same choreography: petition, wait, bribe, hope, rebuild.
Albay.
Protect the young novices who still saw vows as a wedding, not a siege. There were seasons when politics sharpened its knives and called the blade justice. Rebellions flared, empires tightened, and soldiers learned the shortest route from loyalty to cruelty. In those years, the convent wall was less a boundary than a dare. Accusation became currency, harboring rebels, hiding arms, teaching forbidden letters. Sometimes it was true. Sometimes it was the rumor a frightened official needed to believe to explain the violence he was already prepared to perform. Sanctuaries burned because a map demanded it. Icons lacquered with centuries of kisses popped and flaked in the heat, as if the painted saints were shaking off their skins to escape. The shock, if there is to be any, does not live only in the tally of outrages. It lives in the geometry of survival. The abbess learned 3 kinds of speech: to officials, to the sisters, and to God. To officials she spoke the language of obedience sutured with dignity. To the sisters she spoke in practical miracles how to hide the chalice in the flower jar, how to scatter into the orchard in the pattern they had. Rehearsed how to return by the path that left the fewest footprints. To God she said what the Psalms had said for 1,000 years. The water is up to our necks, and still we sing. Girls arrived with eyes too old for their faces, earthquake orphans, raid orphans, hunger orphans. The convent took them in and taught them the crafts that keep grief busy: spinning, chant, the minute goldwork of icon borders. Some stayed and became brides of a promise. Some left with dowries scraped together from market earnings and anonymous alms. A marriage is a different kind of fortress. A daughter is a kingdom you try to plant in safer soil. In calmer decades, the convent felt like a lung-filling schools opened behind shaded courtyards. A tiny clinic treated fevers with decoctions and prayers in equal measure. Gardens healed the ground's memory of soldiers. Muslim women came at dusk, with sick children wrapped in blankets. Jewish women came with baskets of oranges and news. Christian women came with letters for distant relatives addressed simply to the sisters who still remember us. And the sisters remembered. Memory was their profession as much as prayer. Power is rarely monolithic in the way fear imagines. Even within the empire's structures, justice found partisans who loved it out of habit. A provincial judge dismissed a false charge because the accuser's face twitched when he lied. A tax inspector rounded down instead of up and told nobody. The governor's wife sent an unsigned note with a list of officers to avoid. These were not stories with trumpets at the end, but they bent history by the smallest degree sufficient, sometimes to miss the reef. Yet history also remembers the broken. It remembers an abbess named Euproxia, or Melania, or an ordinary. Very names scattered like breadcrumbs through chronicles, standing with her back to the icon screen, while a mob frothed at the narthex, demanding keys, demanding hostages, demanding the intangible. The compliance of the holy. It remembers sisters who slipped into the night with their parchment gospels wrapped in wool, carrying a lineage on their shoulders like a fugitive light. It remembers the years when walls went up and came down and went up again, the plaster still dusting their sleeves during vigil. The worst wound may be the one that does not scar silences that never quite healed. There is a pause between bell strikes that was not there before, a listening that gets passed from generation to generation like an heirloom. The sound of distant laughter from a barracks can still turn bread stale in a novice's mouth. The smell of tallow on a uniform can still make a sister think of tickets to safety that never arrived. Even after firewood stacks grow taller and winter passes kindly, the habit of flinching sits in the body like old weather in a knee. But shock, if it seeks truth, must look at the whole sky. There were sultans who confirmed protections, viziers who chastised predatory officials, imams who scolded men for swaggering into churches as if God were not watching. There were also uprisings that tore restraint from the hands of the oppressed and turned it into vengeance, hard to recognize as justice. Nuns tended the wounds of neighbors without tallying what banner had caused them. They learned there are days when only kindness is legal. When empire began to loosen and borders learned new names, the convents felt the tremor before the maps changed. Draft notices, rumors of conscription, new tax schedules, new inspectors' familiar storms arriving in unfamiliar uniforms. The sisters had already made an art of continuity. They had written their story in erasable script on stubborn stone, and stone knows how to wait. The choir kept its pitch through the fashions of power, and that constancy was its own defiance. Holiness does not shout. It persists. What really happened? Crises arrived like seasons, predictable in their unpredictability. Nuns negotiated with men whose hands smelled of ink and men whose hands smelled of iron. They paid too much for permission to fix a roof. They buried sisters at dawn before a soldier could requisition the bier. They hid girls whose plaits had been cut as warnings. They bound wounds with linen stripped from altar cloths, then washed the cloths and put them back, because the sacred knows how to return to work after emergency. They tasted the bitterness of rescue that came late, and the unforeseen sweetness of rescue that came from unlikely quarters. What is shocking is not that cruelty existed. Cruelty is an old professional. What shocks is to find how elastic the human vow can be. A woman promises to devote her life to prayer, and then the world demands that she also become an accountant, diplomat, a smuggler of hope, a wall that absorbs blows without collapsing. She learns the grammar of a half-dozen authorities and the loopholes that keep bread in the pantry. She corrects a child, Skiri under her breath, while presenting a property deed to an official whose seal could decide the winter. She lives as if the divine is always a heartbeat away, and as if danger is always a door away, because both are true. In secret, there were schools, sometimes only 3 girls around a wax tablet in a storeroom that smelled of olives, sometimes a dozen in a loft with a hidden window. Letters form a spine you can lean on when the ground tilts. Scripture and Psalter, arithmetic, and the story of saints who postponed their deaths with wit and found ways to do good even when the law had other plans. Learning was not rebellion for its own sake. It was a small ark in a flood. There were days of brightness, too bright to forget. Pascha at midnight, the courtyard lit like a second Milky Way. Neighbors of every faith pressing to the gate to watch the procession, because joy performs a public service. A child healed against the odds. A drought broken after the abbess sent the last oil in the lamp to a widow who had nothing left to cook with. A Turkish baker who sent warm bread during Lent because he could not watch women go hungry. A rabbi who loaned a sacred book cover so a gospel could travel safely to a safer province. These are not exceptions that erase the ledger of harm. They are entries on a separate page that must be read alongside it. And yes, there were martyrs in veils, not theatrical, not seeking an audience, only women who stood where they stood because running had run out and choices had been spent. Their names shine on church walls and in the corners of family stories, their feast days' small lights and calendars crowded with history. They do not change what happened. They teach how to walk afterward. Empires age. They crack along their confident lines. The day comes when a new flag learns to fly over old courtyards. The nuns keep their habits and mend their habits. They plant new trees over the stumps of old. They copy service books again, this time with margins and a different language notes, for how to talk to a future that hasn't met them yet. The bell rings, sometimes bronze, sometimes a wooden Simontron, because metal is forbidden. Sometimes only a knuckle against a door frame at the appointed hour. The sound means, we are still here. What happened to Christian nuns under Ottoman rule is not a single story angled toward a simple moral. It is a tapestry woven tight with contradictions, protection and extortion, sanctuary and violation, patronage and predation. It is a map of courage marked with receipts. It is the way an empire can become a weather system you learn to read without trusting. It is the discovery that holiness is not an escape hatch, but a furnace that hardens resolve without scorching mercy. The last candle burns low. Wind touches the convent wall with a hand that resembles memory. Somewhere a door is closing. Somewhere else a door is opening. Sisters cross an unlit courtyard with the practiced step of those who know the ground by heart. History pauses at the gate, as it always does, and then passes on. In the chapel, the psalm rises again, the same words said by different mouths. The syllables like stones laid across a river. Oceans of rule and revolt have washed through this place, and still the hymn remembers its root. If shock remains, let it be this. After everything, the voices are unbroken. The vow endures like a ring worn thin, but not through. And the lamp, inexplicably, refuses to go out.